Welcome back to another episode of The Road Chose Me. My name's Dan Grech, and today a topic that I get asked about all the time related to driving around the world, and that is, what about local languages as you're going? Do you really need to learn the languages? How hard is the trip going to be if you don't? And what have my experiences been as I've moved around the world? So if you're wondering about languages, if you're looking to take your overlanding internationally, stick around, we'll get into all the details right now. So to explain a bit more about the languages I learned as I drove around the world, I'll tell you my story and how I got into all of this. So I grew up in a small town in Australia, and actually at high school, I did learn a couple of languages. We were taught Italian and actually Indonesian for 2 years each. And I think that was just a result of teachers happened to be at the school who spoke those languages. It wasn't actually like, Australian mandated. I think it's just mandated you learn a language, but not specifically which one. But my experience in high school was I learned the days of the week, I learned to count how to 10, and I learned how to say grandmother. And that was really it. In terms of actually being useful, I don't feel like I learned anything at all. And so then as I went through university, as I started getting out into the world, I really didn't have any idea how to speak another language. And I honestly didn't think I was capable of it. I have an engineer's brain, and I just didn't think it was possible. And so I did a little bit of traveling around the world, but mostly in English-speaking countries or where English would easily get me by. And so it wasn't until I tried to drive the Pan American Highway that I really had to tackle a new language. And if it makes you feel any better, on the day I drove into Mexico, I actually didn't speak a single word of Spanish, and I tried to use a couple of Italian words that I vaguely remembered in an attempt to communicate with the border guard. But of course, he spoke enough English, so it was irrelevant. So for my first days and weeks in Mexico, I didn't speak a word. I remember the first time I tried to buy gas, I just pointed at the gas, not the diesel, and the attendant gave me a thumbs up. And then he was trying to ask me how much I wanted. And I didn't know how to say that, so I knew how to say more. I don't remember how I looked it up, but it's just mas in Spanish. So I just sort of said, mas. And he gave me a thumbs up, and he actually said full in English, which I nodded to vigorously. And then he said the Spanish word, which is lleno. And I didn't know that at the time, so I immediately pulled out my little notebook and I wrote it down. Full equals lleno. And that's actually how I learned Spanish for the first month or 3 on the road. Every time I heard a new word, every time I tried to achieve something, I would either look it up in my little pocket dictionary, or I would try to ask someone and write it down. And in Baja California, they speak plenty of English, and with my terrible Spanish, it was enough to get by. And so what I learned as the weeks turned into months was that speaking hardly any Spanish, it was actually plenty enough to get the trip done. And I have met people driving around the world who don't speak any local language at all, and they're still crossing all of the borders, they're still getting visas, immigration, customs, buying gas, getting food, getting a place to camp. You can achieve all of that without speaking any of the local language. But what I learned really quickly is that while that was good enough, I wanted more than that. I really wanted to talk to local people. I wanted to understand what life was like for them. I wanted to be able to buy street food. I wanted to be able to exchange money and haggle a little bit. Even I would go into a bar in Mexico and order a beer, and someone would slide up next to me and start chatting because they're kind of curious, like, who are you? Where are you from? But pretty quickly, I could only parrot like 3 words in Spanish, and they would just sort of be like, oh, okay, this is useless. Like, cheers, have a good night. And then they would shuffle away again. So I became sort of frustrated that I couldn't have these conversations and I couldn't chit chat to people. So what I actually did is I took a week of intensive Spanish lessons in El Salvador, and that changed my world entirely. By then, I guess I'd already learned maybe 100 words that were useful for everyday life. But then with this intensive course, it was an enormous amount of content. And probably if I went and read my notes right now, I would still learn more from those lessons I took back in 2009. And so for me, that really made my trip so much more enjoyable. And after that, I just picked it up in leaps and bounds. And actually at the end of the trip, I was going maybe a week at a time without even speaking a word of English. And I got to the point where I was even dreaming in Spanish. And so that was a real achievement for me. I was really proud of that. I didn't know that I was capable of that. And it was another one of the challenges of the trip that I'm really proud that, you know, I sort of set myself a goal and I studied and I worked it and I achieved it. And part of the way I did that was just brute memorization. I just had notes scrawled, and every day while I was driving, I would just repeat the words over and over until they stuck in my memory. So for me, learning Spanish was a really big achievement, and I'm really proud I did it, and I'm happy. When it came to Africa, I knew that West Africa predominantly speaks French, and so I knew from my experience I wanted to speak some of the local language. So actually, when I was back in Canada saving money, I enrolled in French classes, given that French is the second language of Canada. And it was really a shock for me. As soon as I got into class, I wanted to just use all the words I knew in Spanish and try and get the French equivalent, and then I'd be good to go. But of course, they wanted to teach me the days of the week and how to say grandmother and how to say window. And it was all useless. And I had all these flashbacks to high school where I was like, I can't learn this. This is terrible. And so I hated those classes, and I actually dropped out and didn't even continue. So when I got to West Africa, once again, I only spoke maybe 10 or 20 words of French, and I just did the same thing. I just went brute memorization. I had a little pocket translator book and I scrawled notes every day. I really wanted to be able to deal with the numbers so I could do prices. I wanted to be able to talk to gas station attendants and all of that. And definitely having Spanish as a background, it did really help with French. So, you know, a lot of the words are similar, although the pronunciation's quite different. And with my Australian accent, you know, my French accent, it is terrible. When I speak French here in Canada, people usually don't let me speak French, they just switch back to English. But that is something that I learned too. When you're in Latin America, when you're in Africa, people aren't going to be rude like that. They aren't going to correct you or kind of turn up their noses at you. They are ecstatic that you learned some of their language. Even if you can only say, hello, how are you? Puts a huge smile on people's faces, and they're so happy, and it changes the whole way that you interact with them. So from that standpoint, I highly, highly recommend you learn, you know, at least 20 or 50 of the most useful words, usually greetings, you know, thank you, please, yes, no, left, right. All of those words, they're just so helpful day to day. So West Africa was mostly French speaking. There are a couple of Portuguese speaking countries as well, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, then Mozambique down in the southeast. And in the Portuguese speaking countries, I actually just spoke Spanish and they understood me perfectly because that's how smart they are, but I couldn't understand much of what they were saying back to me in Portuguese. And again, I did try hard to learn the 50 or 100 most useful words in Portuguese. I did learn to count to 100, all of those kind of basic things, and that was plenty enough to get me by. As you move up the east coast of Africa, lots and lots of English for most of the trip. I dropped into a couple of French-speaking countries again, like Burundi and Djibouti, and that was really fun because I kind of was confident enough that I'm like, oh yeah, I can handle this, and it felt like being back in West Africa, so I had a great time. But then there were a couple of countries too. When I was remote in Tanzania, they really only speak Swahili, and I had a goal on myself. I wanted to learn Swahili, and I just never put in the time, to be honest. I think I learned about 10 or 20 words. So there were certainly interactions, you know, street markets and things where I could not communicate at all. And it still worked fine. Once you've been traveling for a while, you know, a lady selling some carrots, you can point to the carrots, you can say like 4, and if you're smiling, she'll put them in a bag and hold them out to you. You can hold out your hand with money in it, and she'll just take the right amount of money. And so many times I had them, you know, work hard to get me change from maybe the 50 cents I'd given them so they could give me my 10 or 20 cents of change or whatever I needed. So people are really honest, and you will manage to do those kinds of things even with a language barrier. But from experience, I can tell you, it's way more fun to learn the language. So that's French and Spanish speaking countries. If I was headed to Central Asia, I would absolutely learn some Russian. And from what I understand, Russian is a really hard language to learn. So I'm probably not going to try and learn all of the grammar and all the conjugations and all the complicated stuff. But as I said, please, thank you, hello, yes, no, maybe, you know, things that are going to get a good reaction out of people. Absolutely, those are really worth knowing. Probably nice to be able to at least count to 10 so you can have some idea of numbers. And other parts of the world as well. Totally depends on where you're going, but do your research, find out what a commonly spoken language is, and put in the effort to learn those 20 or 50 words. They're going to completely change the color of your day. A couple of exceptions though. You might remember back in my bribery videos, I said you may not want to speak to the corrupt military or police in their local language. And that's something you'll have to get used to for you and see how it works. Personally, I might greet them in their language, but then pretty quickly make it clear I don't really speak any more of their language. That's going to make them have to speak English, which kind of puts them at a disadvantage when they're trying to explain to me why I have to give them $100 for some made-up reason. So I personally try not to speak the local language to guys who I think are going to bribe me. But on the flip side, if I'm at the border and the immigration guys are just stamping my passport, absolutely, I'll chat to them all day long, or, walk outside and buy street food, because I want to be friendly and I want to, meet those people and see what life is about. So how good is my Spanish today? Entonces, no tengo la oportunidad para practicar mucho ahora, pero puedo entender mucho español. Entonces, puedo viajar todos los mundos en español, más o menos bien. So I hope that rambling tale is helpful, and I hope it gets you thinking about something else you can add to your list of things to do or to plan for when you set out internationally. And I hope it doesn't seem overwhelming, because it isn't. You can drive into Mexico without speaking a word of Spanish, and in your first days and weeks, you just slowly start accumulating all the words that you need for day-to-day life. And then at some point, it's going to be up to you to decide how passionate are you about chit-chatting to locals and really getting to know people, being able to barter, all of those kinds of things. So if this video has been helpful, please do hit the thumbs up, subscribe. I'm putting out new videos every Monday and Thursday, and I'm always open to your input on what topics you would like to know more about. So if you've always wondered something about driving around the world, don't hesitate to ask, leave a comment down below, and I'll probably think about it for a week or two, and then I'll happily film a video, hopefully to answer your questions and help you get out there and have your own massive adventures. So until next time, maybe spring's coming, maybe winter's coming back, who would possibly know? Stay safe out there, and maybe I'll bump into you on the road.